Okay, y'all, welcome. Good morning, and we're glad you're here with us for module number 4 of the Tennessee Principal Professional Learning Series. And as many of you may know, this is a program of 7 professional learning modules that are designed to provide information and hopefully support professional conversation around some topics that we believe will be immediately relevant to school leadership during the current public health crisis and as we look to moving forward into the new academic year. My name is Jim McIntyre, and I serve as the director of the Center for Educational Leadership at the University of Tennessee. And as we begin, I want to acknowledge and thank Commissioner Schwinn and the Tennessee Department of Education for making this opportunity available to public school principals in Tennessee. And I also want to recognize the support of our content experts and our philanthropic supporters, including the American Institutes for Research, Instruction Partners, and Tennessee SCORE. Today's session is on assessing student learning, and it's organized around 2 recorded video presentations that will explore how we know what our students have learned during the quarantine when schools have been closed, and how we can leverage this information to inform our instruction and our planning. After each of the presentations, you'll have some opportunity for some small group discussion among your peers, and you can access all of the resources for this session on the web address on our website at the Center for Educational Leadership. On the web address is listed on the current slide. So, and this slide also shows where we are in the Principal Professional Learning series. We're in the 4th of 7 modules, and today's module and the next few weeks will really focus on the future. They'll focus on future looking and future planning modules that will help us think about how we organize schooling to best serve our students in the fall. As we get further along in today's session, I will provide a link to a survey that I ask you to fill out. We love to have the feedback on making sure that this experience is working well for you as school leaders. And also it allows us to know that you're here. It allows the Tennessee Department of Education to apply your TESOL credit to the appropriate year, either this year or next year. Before we get started, on a more personal note, I do think it's important to acknowledge the painful landscape that our country finds itself in at this moment with regard to race and to equity. You know, so many of us were outraged by the recent killing of George Floyd and many other unarmed African-American individuals in the past. I recognize the trauma and the pain that racism and discrimination have inflicted on our students, as well as on many of our teachers and staff and leaders. Black Lives Matter in all of our schools. And at the Center for Educational Leadership, we stand in solidarity with our African-American students, colleagues, and families. And we strongly condemn racism in all of its forms. You know, there are many ways to combat the horrible plague of racism. And I believe one of the most important foundational strategies is to provide a high quality, equitable public education for every child in this nation. And at this troubling moment, I hope you will join me in redoubling our efforts to eliminate ignorance, provide opportunity, and ensure a just, equitable, and bright future for all of our children. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to say that as well. This morning, we're honored to have Emily Freitag from Instruction Partners and Amy Fagan from the American Institutes for Research as our expert presenters on assessing student learning. We're going to begin with a video presentation on learning loss. It runs about 11 minutes. And as we begin, I want to share with you a few questions to be thinking about as you listen to this presentation. So what you see on the slide is after the presentation from the American Institutes for Research, we'll have a few minutes to talk about a few questions and things like, you know, based on research in the current crisis, do you anticipate academic learning loss for students at your school? And what do you think that might look like? And are there some mitigating or exacerbating factors that might play into that? So I'm going to start us with a video presentation from the American Institutes for Research. As has been our protocol, if you don't mind, turn off your video while we're showing the presentation. But then once we get into the small group conversation, I'll ask you to turn on your video and your microphone so we can have a really strong, robust conversation. So I will start us right now with our video from the American Institutes for Research.
Hello, I want to welcome you all to our session on learning loss as a result of COVID-19. My name is Amy Fagan, and I'm a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research, where I work on research and evaluation projects and oversee research for Regional Educational Laboratory Midwest. I live and work in Chicago, Illinois. I hope that you are all well in the midst of these very challenging times. As a participant in this session, my goal is for you to leave the session with, first, an understanding of the research on learning loss under normal conditions. Most research to date on learning loss has focused on summer vacation. Second, an understanding of how learning loss may be different in the context of COVID-19 due to some potential mitigating and exacerbating factors. And finally, some initial ideas about how you can apply this research in combination with your experience and expertise as a school leader to support your teachers to address learning gaps when students return to school in the fall. First, I'm going to focus on what the research says about learning loss. Researchers have been studying learning loss, particularly losses during the summer months, for decades. The earliest study I found in the literature was from the 1970s. A frequently cited research synthesis published in 1996 found that students lose approximately 1 month of instruction on average over the summer. Findings from more recent research studies have been more mixed. Some studies have found average learning losses throughout the summer, and others have found more stagnation or slowdown in gains, but not losses. But perhaps what's most important to think about when we think about learning loss is differences by socioeconomic status, or SES. Research has found that children in low SES households experience greater losses than their more advantaged peers during the summer months. In fact, research from Baltimore has shown that differences in test scores between low SES households and middle SES households was driven by learning loss that occurred during the summer months. This research showed that low SES students progressed at a similar rate as their middle SES peers during the school year, but they fell behind during the summer months, and as a result, by the time they reached grade 5, they were 2.5 to 3 years behind their middle SES peers. So one theory for why this may happen is called faucet theory. Faucet theory posits that over the summer, the flow of resources to students from less advantaged backgrounds slows, while it continues for students from more advantaged backgrounds in the form of access to high-quality summer learning experiences. For example, summer camp or other enrichment activities. Therefore, the gains that students from more advantaged backgrounds made during the school year are maintained or advanced, while the gains that students from less advantaged backgrounds made during the school year may be partially lost. When researchers look at losses by subject area, they have found that the most profound losses occur for math, relative to other tested skill areas, such as literacy. They posit that literacy-related experiences may be more accessible to families than math-related experiences during out-of-school time. For example, families may feel more comfortable reading to their children or asking their children to engage in independent reading during the summer months than engaging in math practice. So what is the cost of this learning loss? For individual students and society, there are lifetime consequences. Some estimates suggest individuals affected by systematic disruptions to education during World War II were still experiencing a sizable earnings loss over 40 years after the war. Now that I've provided some background on the research on learning loss, I want to turn to some research that can help us think about what to expect as a result of COVID-19. Researchers with NWEI, which is the developer of the Measures of Academic Progress, or MAP test, used a national sample of over 5 million students in grades 3 to 8 to make informed projections of learning loss as a result of COVID-19. These projections are based on what we know from prior literature on school absences and analyses of typical summer learning patterns. This graph shows their projections for math. Each horizontal line is a grade level, with 3rd grade at the bottom in red and 8th grade at the top in pink. The x-axis represents time, and there's a dashed line perpendicular to the x-axis in mid-March when schools closed, and again in mid-June when they should have closed for summer in the absence of COVID-19. On the y-axis is a student's assessment score. The solid lines represent what should have happened in a regular year. For every grade level, student scores should have increased over the course of the year and then declined slightly during the summer months. The dashed line represents projections for this year during COVID-19. A few trends are apparent. First, declines are most severe in the earlier grades, with 3rd and 4th graders projected to lose the most learning. Second, it appears that students are losing nearly a full grade level of learning as a result of COVID-19. The authors performed the same simulations for reading. Again, losses were more profound for 3rd and 4th grades than for older grades, but they weren't nearly as severe as they were for math. In fact, you can see very little loss in reading for 7th and 8th grade. This finding is consistent with prior research on learning loss by subject area. So an important caveat to these projections is that they're based on prior literature on school absences and analyses of typical summer learning loss patterns. I want to discuss a few potential mitigating or exacerbating factors that could affect these projections. I'll begin with mitigating factors. Unlike the summer months, most districts are providing some form of distance learning. According to the Center for Reinventing Public Education, as of April 21st, 2020, only 4% of districts reported providing just access to general resources. 41% reported providing formal curriculum, but no instruction or progress monitoring. 12% reported providing curriculum and instruction, but no progress monitoring. And fully 44% reported providing curriculum, instruction, and progress monitoring. So the amount of learning loss may be mitigated by access to high-quality distance learning programs. Consider your distance learning programs for a minute. Do you expect that the experiences provided to students through distance learning may have mitigated learning loss? What gaps were not filled that teachers will need to address when students return to school in the fall? Now I want to turn to discuss potential exacerbating factors, factors that could lead to even more learning loss than expected. First, there's differential access to high-quality distance learning experiences. Families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution are less likely than families in the top fifth of the income distribution to have access to digital learning resources. Students with home internet consistently score higher in reading, math, and science compared to those without home internet. Thus, a newfound reliance on distance learning could serve to perpetuate and exacerbate ongoing gaps in education attainment, graduation, and lifetime earnings between less and more advantaged students. Consider your student population for a minute. Are there gaps in access to digital learning resources that are likely to exacerbate learning loss? Another potential exacerbating factor relates to trauma. As a result of COVID-19, children are experiencing a range of traumas, from illness of caregivers to food and housing insecurity, lack of social services, concerns about safety, and more. These traumas are likely to be felt more by low-income students students from racial ethnic minority backgrounds, students with limited English proficiency, and students with disabilities. Due to trauma, students may not be able to take full advantage of distance education, and they may require substantial emotional support before the work of recovery and learning can begin. Researchers found that students displaced by Hurricane Katrina had difficulty concentrating and had symptoms of depression for months following the hurricane. Similarly, students affected by earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand, showed psychological distress and trouble concentrating for several years afterwards. Consider your student population for a minute. Do you expect trauma to be a challenge affecting your students that will exacerbate learning loss? What supports will teachers need to provide trauma-informed instruction? You'll now work in small groups to brainstorm initial ideas about how you can apply this research in combination with your experience and expertise as a leader to support your teachers to address learning gaps when students return to school in the fall.
Here are the questions that we will discuss in a small group. So just reacting to and thinking about the video that we just heard and saw on learning loss, and a couple of questions here. So I'm going to send us and invite you to go to small groups, and we'll have a couple of facilitators in each of these groups. We'll have about 7 or 8 minutes to be able to have this conversation, and excited to invite you to the breakout rooms for a great professional dialogue. So I'll push the button here, you'll get an invitation. If you accept it, you'll go to the breakout rooms, and we'll do that right now.
Both with COVID and with...
Okay, welcome back everyone, and thank you for your engagement in the small group conversation. We are going to move now to a video presentation from Emily Barton Emily Freitag at Instruction Partners. And this is on really thinking about the purpose of assessment and why do we, what kind of information are we looking for in terms of knowing where our students are in their learning, and then what purpose do we utilize that for? And so that will drive thinking about the strategies that we'll use for assessment. I'm going to share with you a couple of questions that we're going to ask you to be considering after this first part of the presentation, and here they are. So Emily's going to talk about the structure of mathematics and ELA in terms of assessment, and one of the things she's going to give as an example is a unit on the Percy Jackson novel, The Lightning Thief. And so I'm going to ask you about what do we want our students to know about that, and then overall, what do we want our students to know about, and what do we want to know about our students, in terms of their learning from the spring in order to teach them effectively in the fall. So those are a couple of questions that we're going to ask you in the small group after this first segment of the video presentation, and I'll put those in the chat box as well so you can see those and keep those in mind as we go forward. I apologize, Emily had a little bit of some internet issues as she recorded the video, so in a couple places it stretches out a little bit, but you should be able to hear the presentation fairly well, and there's also closed captioning throughout as well. So I'm going to take you now to the video, and we'll go about 20 minutes and then stop again for some small group conversation briefly.
Hi, this is Emily Freitag, co-founder and CEO of Instruction Partners, and I'm so pleased to be with you all today in this really important community of principal learning for the state of Tennessee. I know some of you from my former role as Assistant Commissioner for Curriculum and Instruction, and it's a pleasure to be learning with you. I want to start by just sharing my incredible admiration for the work that school leaders and school system leaders have been doing the past 4 months. The difficulty you are navigating on a daily basis are unparalleled. And I've been so impressed with the work principals have been doing to find students, to support students and families, to close digital divides, to support their teachers in navigating truly unparalleled times. And we're going to have to keep it up. The difficulty is not going to be lessening anytime soon. In fact, it may grow but I know that kids are in great shape having the principles that they do, and I'm eager to be helpful in any way that we can at Instruction Partners. We're here together today to be digging in on assessment. How do we know what our students have learned? And what do we do in order to understand that and act on it? In this session, we're going to seek to clarify the actions that teachers and leaders need to take to support student learning and wellness, identify the data they need to inform those actions and ways to collect that data, and also really talk about the data that we do not need and the unintended risks of the inappropriate use of assessment data. We will frame our conversation. We will talk about how we typically use data. We will talk a little bit about the structure of each discipline and use that to understand the purpose of assessments and our options for assessments, and then talk about strategies and cautions for assessment. Up front, let us name that racism is damaging our country and affecting our students, and that we need to bring that into this conversation. Racism affects how we teach, what we teach, and who we teach. And it is deeply connected specifically to the topic of assessment. In the words of the African American Policy Forum Statement on Standardized Tests, intelligence assessments have historically been used and really originated to try to prove the inferiority of races. The design of assessments are historically led by white people and inherently therefore privileges specific ways of knowing and being. And assessments may measure privilege much more than they do potential. Civil rights groups have also stood by the value of standardized testing, arguing that it is a way to ensure disadvantaged children are identified and not neglected, and it provides potentially less biased information than teacher judgment. We are not going to be debating in this session the merits of standardized assessment, but as leaders and practitioners, we should be informed of the history, conscious of the potential for bias, and examine the actions that we take to use test data carefully. Furthermore, we should be creating cultures and commitments to action that intentionally counteract those potential biases so all students have equal access to opportunity. In this session, we will explicitly seek to provide strategies that will allow educators and leaders to minimize the risk. So let's dig in with focus on two students. These are two fifth graders, rising sixth graders, and they have spent the past 4 months in very different ways. Student A, who, by the way, loves the color yellow, is obsessed with it, and is the oldest of three, has been living in a home with access to internet and engaging regularly on Google Classroom's lessons with her teacher, and she has felt successful. In fact, along with the support of her mother, she has gone beyond the curriculum provided by her school and has been learning a great deal. Student B, she wants to be a scientist. She's an only child. She has read Harry Potter 7 times, and she is living in a home without access to the internet. She has received a couple of phone calls from her teacher, and she was given work packets to complete, but she did not finish the work packets, and she did not feel successful in school. She can explicitly name that she did not feel like she was learning during the distance context, and that she was stressed. She was stressed by the virus, and she was stressed by the protests, and she is not feeling as successful on the past 4 months of learning. So, as a principal, both of these children are in your school. They are rising into 6th grade. So I'll pretend we're middle school principal for a minute. What are some of the questions you would like to understand about these two students as they come into the year? Let me give you a few minutes to put some notes in the chat. What do you want to know more about student A and student B? Give you another minute or two to think about these two students. As this is a pre-recorded video, I cannot identify your comments, but let me tell you some of what others have said. There's a lot we want to know about these two students in their experience of the past several months, their health and their safety. We'd also probably want to hear from their parents and their families about how they have felt and any data that they can bring to bear on how their child is doing, how their family has spent time, what they have spent their time on that they have found engaging, what formats worked well for them, what formats worked less well for them, what they remember most from the previous year, what they missed the most, and what they're looking forward to. What are they hoping for in their own upcoming year? So a great deal of breadth and depth around their motivations and their well-being. Now, we didn't have TN Ready this past year, and so we will not be getting student reports that look like this. But for a minute, we want to reflect on what we used to get and what we did with that information. So this is a sample 9th grade report. And we used to get scale score data on every student. We used to therefore understand for each student what level of mastery they are at. We knew that compared to the school and the district and the state. We also had sub-score data within one, and some notes on strengths, areas for improvement, and next steps. In addition, we had class reports and school reports. So overall, percent of students at different levels compared to the state, the district, the school. And same for, oh, went the wrong way. So what would you have done with this information? Let's pretend we were going to get the reports again and remember what actions that leads us to take. For a minute, go ahead and put into the chat, what would you have done with the TN Ready data? One more minute. Some of the actions we hear about are actions at the student level and then a separate set of actions at the teacher level. At the student level, this data might have informed course placement. This data might have both the course and the level of the course and the class in terms of which teacher. This data might have been used to indicate grouping within a class or additional supports to identify what students might need more support. It also might have informed a teacher in thinking about their scope and sequence. In particular, the sub-scores might have been used to say, okay, based on last year's data, here are some things that I know I'm going to need to reinforce in our scope and sequence this year. At the teacher level, it might have informed for the principal student assignment, so which students are matched to which teacher, or identification of teachers that need more support, or sources of reflection for teachers on their own practice, which students learned more, which didn't, and how can we reflect on our instructional moves in light of that. It also might have affected things like compensation. For the purpose of the balance of this session, we're not going to talk about policy implications like compensation, but we do want to talk about the actions we would take and what data we need in order to support those actions in the coming year. And to do so, we want to dig in a little bit more deeply first on what the first unit of 6th grade actually might look like. So staying in the lens of our two students in math as they approached 6th grade, the first unit of the year might have been about ratios. And this is a good end of module 1 assessment from a high quality curriculum. And let's take a second to read through it. So Elisa hopes to play beach volleyball in the Olympics. She has convinced her parents to allow her to set up her own beach volleyball court in their backyard. And she knows that is approximately 26 feet by 52 feet, and she will need the sand to be 1 foot deep. She goes to the hardware store to shop for sand and sees the following signs on the pallets. First, 60 pounds for $5, the next 150 pounds for $12. What is the rate that brand A is selling for? Give the rate, specify the unit rate, which brand is offering the better value, explain your answer. And then she uses her cell phone to search how many pounds required to fill 1 cubic foot. She finds it's 100. So she needs to choose one of the brands and figure out how much it will cost to fill the quart. Okay, so that's the end of unit assessment for the first unit of 6th grade. I love this problem. I think this problem is so real. It is so real in that math so often integrates so many different domains of thinking, so many different kinds of problem solving. So we have area, we have volume, we have ratio, we have multiplication, we have justification of value. All of this is very real. And so if our 2 students are about to start a unit that should lead to success on this assessment, they nail it, they know how to do this problem, what are some of the things that we would want to know? Well, let's also remember, before we answer that question, a little bit more about the structure of math. As this problem showed us, math is really a network of different types of thinking that come together. It is active sense making, and it is a balance of concepts, procedures, and application. It is not a linear path of learning. It is not one domino that falls after another in a perfect line. It is also not just an input of knowledge. There's no kind of, open the brain, pour in knowledge that is going to prepare a student to succeed with the problem that we just saw. It requires real active learning. It is also not a checklist of skills. Just checking off that a student knows that ratios can be represented with semicolons or the word to or as a fraction is sort of irrelevant to whether they're going to succeed on this problem. Even if they have it, they might not succeed on this problem. And so we have to remember all of that as we think about assessment, because assessment is about what data do we need to make strong instructional choices. So with that in mind, let's pretend you're now the teacher, the math teacher for these 2 students. What would you want to know about their math knowledge and skill before this unit? Some of the things we hear are we'd want to know much more about multiplication and division. We'd want to know about general problem solving, resilience and fluency and comfort. This unit the unit assessment involves many different layers of problem solving, and we'd want to know more about how student A and student B solve problems. We'd want to know about whether student A and student B really understand base 10, because that is still so prerequisite to understanding how to reason with numbers. We'd want to understand a little bit about measurement concepts, area and volume. And we probably want to understand a little bit about fractions. Ultimately, ratio is very connected to fractional reasoning. So those are some of the concepts that we want to really understand before going into teaching this unit, so that we can tailor the way we teach the unit to the strengths and the continued areas of learning that students are presenting. Let's shift now into ELA for a minute. The first unit of 6th grade for ELA might be about the lightning thief, very commonly studied book in 6th grade. And this is a good end of Module 1 unit assessment for a study on the lightning thief and the hero's journey. So I'll just read that students would be asked to focus on one experience in the lightning thief and show how Percy's experience aligns to the stages in the hero's journey. So that's a nonfiction text they would be reading. And conclude by describing what we can learn about Percy as a hero from his response to a challenge he faces, and use evidence from both texts to support the response. So this is such a rich problem, and it's so relevant to students' success as they prepare for college and beyond. Are they able to read multiple complex texts and craft an argument to support claims about those texts? What we know about the structure of ELA is that there are some gateway foundational skills that students need in order to be fluent in their reading. And that includes phonological and phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. And then with every text that students read and that we read, there's 4 questions we really work through. The first is, what does the text say? Can I understand what it's saying? How does the text work? What does the text mean? And how does the text connect to other texts and other ideas? This unit assessment is related to that question. So it requires a deep understanding of what both texts are saying, how they're working, what they mean, and how they connect. And in order to do that, students need to draw on a number of different things. They need to draw on evidence-based discourse. They need to know how to plan a discussion, gather evidence, organize their thinking, build discussion skills and habits. They need to also be able to draw on careful and close reading. They need to know how to read a text closely and analyze the author's craft and structure and compare and connect. They also need to build their academic language. They need to know which words to teach. They need to understand the meaning of those words, literal and non-literal, and they need to understand word relationships. They finally need to draw on ability to produce a volume and range of writing. They need to know what purpose to write for, how to write, both composing and construction of writing. And so it's worth noting that the structure of ELA is not a collection of discrete skills, much like math is not. So taking one classic example, we see a lot of lessons on main idea treated as a skill. Do students have the skill of main idea? And yet we know that main idea, each text has its own main idea. And because each text is different, what it takes to locate, identify, and construct a main idea will vary greatly from text to text. So ability to identify main idea in one text does not necessarily predict ability to identify main idea in another text. This is so important as we talk about assessment, of course, because we need to be very careful in what we are assessing for. And in ELA in particular, a great deal of assessments are skill-based assessments, treating discrete skills as replicable, even if we know they are not. And so let's center on what would we actually want to know about student A and student B's ELA knowledge and skill prior to starting the Lightning Thief unit. Let me give you a couple of minutes to generate some ideas on what we would want to know.
Okay, so we are going to, I know Emily's question was sort of rhetorical, but we're going to actually answer it. So we're going to go to small group real quick and think about what would you want to know about these two students' ELA knowledge and skills at the beginning of the school year as they start a unit on the Lightning Thief. But more broadly, what do you want to know about your students learning from the spring in order to teach them effectively in the fall? So extrapolate that to the general. And well, this is a real quick interaction. We'll only have about 5 or 6 minutes, but I will invite you to small groups right now, and then we'll come back and hear the rest of the presentation from Emily, which is really about the purpose of assessment and how to align your strategy to purpose. So I'll invite you to small groups right now. Okay, welcome back from small group. I know that was quick and I apologize for that, but hopefully at least a good beginning to a conversation talking about the needs of our students and what we need to know about them in terms of their learning, in order to enable great instruction going forward. I'm going to continue the video with Emily Freitag and Instruction Partners. She's going to begin talking about the purpose of assessment and why we do assessments and how it can inform our instruction. And so I'm going to give you a series of questions to be thinking about as you listen and watch the video. And again, what are the most important actions you want to take in terms of understanding where your students are academically? What is the culture of assessment going to look like in your building? What do you want to promote? What do you want to avoid? If we have a chance, I will send you a link to our website. I put it in the chat, but I'll do it again. The Tennessee Department of Education, just in the last few days, put out something called an Innovative Assessment Supports document. And if you have time in the small group, you might want to at least touch on that and take a look at it. And then I'm going to leave you with a takeaway question for our session today, which is, what are you going to do as next steps to support effective use of assessment to inform instruction for your teachers and your kids? So I will get us back to Emily Freitag and the Instruction Partners video right now.
Some of the things we have heard. One, have they read The Lightning Thief before? Is this the book you've read before? Two, knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology. For those that know the book, The Lightning Thief, which is a wonderful read if you're looking for one right now. It is really about the gods and the goddesses and their journey in a new form. And in order to know how to teach the Lightning Thief and to help students understand Percy and what Percy goes through, there's a lot students will need to know about Greek and Roman mythology. Not knowing more about what students know about Greek and Roman mythology will also help target the right vocabulary instruction. We also might want to know what kinds of things students like to read generally in order to understand how to tap into that interest and connection with this text. And we want to know a little bit about what they know about heroes and what heroes, the schema of heroes. That much more than any reading skill would inform a teacher's approach to teaching this unit. So I know we've gone quite deep in content for these past 10 minutes, and I want to bring us back. I know we are leaders. I am talking to a group of leaders that are trying to make systematic decisions. And so let's take that content knowledge and the knowledge of these two students to really think about, what does this look like at the system and the school level? To do that, I want to spend just a minute on purpose. There are multiple purposes for assessing, and it's very important that we are clear on what purpose we are trying to accomplish before we launch an assessment. The three categories of purposes are evaluative, predictive, and instructional. Evaluative assessments are designed to measure student learning across a wide swath of standards, to monitor and track student performance as a group, and to truly evaluate student performance. Examples of evaluative assessments would be the state test and the ACT or the SAT. Predictive assessments aspire to indicate whether a student is on track to meeting a certain bar on the end of year test. Predictive assessments can be aggregated in different ways. They can be used as a screener. They are generally used to try to identify students that need more support in order to change the level that they are tracking towards. Examples of predictive assessments would include full-length practice tests and a wide variety of commercial tests that claim predictive validity. Instructional assessments are assessments that are designed to help educators adapt their instruction to meet student needs. So instructional assessments are intentionally designed to inform the learning experience. And I want to note a caution about three terms that we often use in assessment conversations that may be misunderstood. The first is formative. We talk about formative generally, and from this Achievement Network paper, Teaching Comes First, I liked the quote, "It is reasonably clear that there is not agreement about what constitutes a formative assessment in education." So the word formative, frankly, gets used all the time with very different meanings. There's not a common definition of formative. I would prefer to use the word instructional assessments. Some people would say that formative is intended to overlap with instructional, but often formative is talked about in evaluative or predictive terms as well. So we're just going to avoid the use formative altogether, given that it has many interpretations. The second word that we often use is interim. And an interim assessment would mark the frequency of assessment, but an interim assessment doesn't have a purpose in and of itself. It would be the space and time between delivering assessments that would have other purposes. So and then third, and probably most relevant to this time, is the word diagnostic. And I had a very interesting conversation with Scott Marion at the Center for Assessment that we'll link resources towards about this word. And in education, truly, the word diagnostic should specifically refer to assessments that would be identifying disabilities. So, example, a diagnostic to inform a dyslexia diagnosis. And diagnostic is obviously a very loaded word right now in medical terms as well. But it's important to remember that we diagnose problems, not people. So I think the word diagnostic often gets used to indicate, for a teacher, I want to understand what my students know in order to build on that. That would be an but the notion of diagnose would require just a tremendous length and depth and breadth, and might not actually be that actionable. We should be diagnosing specific theories or diagnosing specific needs. But a diagnostic as a blanket term is really a problematic term. So we're going to stick with evaluative, predictive, and instructional. And let's talk about what those each could look like for our fifth graders. So our fifth graders, rising sixth graders are coming into sixth grade. How could we assess? Well, if we had an evaluative purpose, that would look like giving a full-length fifth grade Tennessee Ready test, or a replica version, could be a commercial version that tries to aspire to do the same thing. And what would that allow us to do? That would allow us to identify which students are at each performance level for fifth grade, identify which domains are stronger or less strong in fifth grade, identify which teachers are stronger, and tell people how this compares to last year's results. A predictive assessment could look like giving a full-length sixth grade practice test or a replica version. And what would that allow us to do? Well, that would allow us to identify which students are tracking to each performance level for sixth grade, identify which domains students are stronger or less strong in for sixth grade, and even though we haven't taught any of them yet, and identify which teachers have students tracking towards mastery. Instructional assessments might look like asking students questions related to the most important content of the unit and examining work on those questions. And that would allow a teacher to identify what students do and do not know on the topic of instruction. So of these, which purposes are actionable? Which allow us to do something significant? Take a minute and just look at the list on the right, and which of these purposes is really essential to managing your school? I'm going to narrate through my theory on this. Let's start with evaluative purposes. Assessments that allow us to identify which students are at each performance level for 5th grade. So that is interesting, but I do not think that is actionable unless it is going to change the schedule or the assignment of students or the curriculum. That does not change behaviors. And I think we would not want to use that data to change our starting point for students. We would want to use that data. We'd want to know more about student work in order to strengthen how we teach that content. But knowing that students are behind wouldn't necessarily lead us to therefore stop and go back and reteach that, because the content is all very connected and cohesive. And so we can support those learning needs in the context of on-grade level teaching. Identifying which domains students are stronger at or less strong in 5th grade. I don't know that we need 8 hours of assessment in order to do that in a productive way, as much as we need to know what students do and do not know on the topic of instruction. Identifying which teachers are stronger and need more support. We have a lot of data on that from a number of sources, so I'm not sure that additional data on that in terms of benchmark assessment would be helpful. And telling people how this compares to last year, that may be interesting, but I'm also not sure that is actionable. It may increase our sense of urgency, but I don't know that it would change behaviors. And certainly predictive assessment purposes are not actionable at the start of the year. Identifying which students are tracking towards 6th grade, that does not change whether you are teaching the content to all students or not. Identify which domains students are stronger at for 6th grade. Well, we haven't taught any of the domains yet. And identify which teachers have students tracking towards mastery. We already have plenty of data on students that would allow us to understand that from their prior grade levels that are likely still true. So the evaluative and predictive purposes are truly not as actionable as the instructional purposes. And so, like the Achievement Network paper, we would suggest that the instructional purposes are the most important to organize your entire assessment strategy around. What does a teacher need in order to teach well? And that is the data that is needed. And that is the only data that would be needed. And so as principles and strategies for how to assess this coming year, we would suggest first, do no harm. What does that mean? That means do focus on building supportive relationships. Do not trigger trauma with assessments. Do not use invalid or unreliable assessments. And do not use assessments to label students or to sort them. Do prioritize instructional purposes. What does that look like? What are the strategies to do so? 1, prioritize content. Get very clear on what is the most important content for the grade and for this unit. Fortunately, there are some great resources we're going to share in a minute that help do that. But it is really, truly not important to understand whether students know what a rhombus is in order to teach ratio. And so assessing on that is actually an opportunity cost for that time. Other strategies. Do support teachers in examining student work. Student work analysis is going to be the most important instructional assessment strategy that you have to target good instruction. And teachers will need help understanding how to examine student work. That, more than adding additional assessments, should be the heart of a good assessment strategy, particularly in the aftermath of COVID. Do use the assessments in your curriculum first. Any great curriculum is filled with assessments, exit slips, mid-module units, end-of-module units. Some are multiple choice, some are more open-ended. Those are the assessments that are intentionally designed to support the learning of the targeted content. And before layering on additional assessments, look at the assessments in your curriculum and use those first. Do use assessment results to scaffold instruction within grade level instruction. So use student work analysis to change the questions that you're asking students. But do not assess on non-priority content. Do not use assessment results to stop and go back. It is within the river of what students are learning that we can reinforce their skills. And do not layer on additional assessments that do not provide new information. Finally, reduce or minimize everything else. This is a great time to take an inventory of every assessment that students are taking. In many cases, leaders have found that they don't even know all of the assessments that are taking place in their systems or their buildings because they're coming from so many different sources. And before we go into a year where time is going to be the most precious resource we all have, let us make sure that we're using every minute wisely and reduce unnecessary assessments. Do not assess unless you have a worthy purpose and a plan for how you will use the data. Not just oh, it would be good to have this data, but if I don't have this data, I am literally not going to be able to do my job. That's the bar that we should have for assessment. And very frequently, we might not be at that bar, even though we have felt like we were in the past. These are the principles and strategies we would recommend for assessment. And in terms of what this could look like, very simply, you'll have the state test, the ACT, SAT at the end of the year. That is the only needed evaluative assessment. If you feel a great need for a predictive assessment, one full-length practice test in the winter gives students an opportunity to practice with the format and then allows teachers to identify students that might have some additional need. But other than that, this should be the priority. And that would look like student work analysis based on curriculum-based assessments throughout the year. If needed, an RTI screener in elementary in the fall makes sense. But other than that, all progress monitoring should be able to be done through those assessments. And so, going the wrong way. A few resources and then a few closing thoughts. Student Achievement Partners has produced prioritized content guides. We'll link those in the follow-up, and they are incredibly helpful in identifying within each grade the most important content. Time will be precious this year, and so let's focus our energy where it is most valued for student learning. We also encourage leaders to look at the Louisiana benchmark assessment reviews. Before you buy a single assessment, make sure it is good. And Louisiana's assessment reviews are the easiest way to do so. We also have an assessment inventory, and that is on our curriculum support website and allows leaders to work through a set of questions to really understand what assessments are you giving and what are you doing with the data? And are those purposes equal to the time they are taking? And are there other ways to think about how you're doing that? We encourage leaders to take a day with their leadership team to work through that inventory. Achievement Network has 3 principles for assessment during recovery and beyond. Great article and good for a leadership team study. And we have included Scott Marion's Rethinking Intervention interview and encourage you to take a look at that, particularly if you're getting pushed to really use comprehensive diagnostics and you want to explore that more deeply. Center for Assessment also has a number of blogs, including a Rethinking Assessment and Learning blog, particular to COVID. And as a final note about trauma and assessment, where do we hear the word testing the most right now? It is in connection to COVID testing. My 4-year-old is obsessed with COVID testing. He had to get tested to see grandma. It was extremely painful. He talks about it every day. And if he went into school and they said, we're going to take a test right now, he would absolutely associate that with COVID testing, and it would scare him. Instead, I think much gentler approaches to assessment and language around them. I want to better understand what you know. I want to see what you're great at. Those kinds of framings of the kinds of open-ended, listen to me using the word diagnostic, open-ended, upfront student questions, I think are a much better approach, particularly given this time. So I think the worst case scenario for assessment in the aftermath of COVID is that students are given tests that scare them and produce invalid or unreliable data that teachers and leaders use to label and sort students in ways that both make them feel worse about themselves and then take action on that actually puts them further behind. That is the risk. The best case scenario would be that in the context of genuinely caring relationships, students produce targeted work that allows the teacher to understand what they do know and what they do not yet know. And they are able to use this information to build on student strengths by asking questions and providing learning experiences that help students learn more. Both are possible, and let us do all we can to ensure that our students have the best case scenario experience of assessment. Next week, we look forward to joining you for Class 5 to talk more about personalized learning and instructional planning. And we wish you great success as you are planning for the coming year and one step at a time together. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, emily.freitag@instructionpartners.org, or Dr. Chrissy Turner, who will be joining us next week in Class 5 at chrissy.turner@instructionpartners.org. Be well, and let's keep learning together.
Excellent. Our thanks to Emily Freitag and Instruction Partners for that great conversation about assessment. We are going to go quickly back to small group conversation, and I am going to just to remind us very quickly of the questions that you're going to talk about. Really, the most important one is, what are the actions you're going to take? What are you thinking about in terms of how you will know where your students are in terms of their learning, and how will you go about doing that to inform instruction? We probably won't have time to look at the Tennessee Department of Education's Innovative Assessment Supports document, but I encourage you to go to our website and do take a look at that and think about which of the ideas and strategies that are outlined in there might meet your purposes for assessment. So I'm going to invite you back to small groups right now. We'll have probably about 6 or 7 minutes, then we'll come back together and wrap up and send you on our way about the top of the hour. And I'll invite you to our small groups right now. Welcome back from the small group. I hope you had a great conversation, if brief conversation. We are just about out of time, but we've got a couple of minutes where we want to do a few just very last things here. So I will share my screen, and you see that I'd love to just hear from participants anything that you heard or was said in your small group that you might want to share with the whole group. Any insights, any comments, any sort of takeaways on the issues of assessment and student learning that we've really worked through today, particularly around sort of the purpose of assessment conversations that we've been hearing with Instruction Partners and with the American Institutes for Research. So I'll open it up. If you have any comments or takeaways you'd like to share or insights, you can just turn on your video and turn on your microphone and share it with the group, if you would, please.
I'd just like to share that I'm glad that they're giving the autonomy back to the teachers to really look at the purpose of assessment and that it's going to drive the instruction for the students. So that was refreshing to hear. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that we really need to be purposeful about in this moment when we're relying on our teachers so much to provide great instruction. We want to make sure that we utilize assessment that's going to be valuable to them in informing their instruction. And thank you, because next week is our principal professional learning session is on differentiation and on personalization, on intervention, and again, something where we want to provide some tools and resources and supports to our teachers to be able to do that work with our kids really well. So that'll be next week's sessions. And thank you for that. I appreciate that insight. Any other final thoughts or comments or insights from the small group conversation about our learning on assessment today?
And Dr. McIntyre, our group was very, very collaborative and very communicating about the need to have a clear purpose for the assessment. And they really thought that the presentation was very specific about that you need to have a rationale. The students needed to understand why there was any kind of assessment, and also needed to go back and have a mentoring relationship with the students as well, because they'd been through trauma, the teachers had been through it, and there needed to be a relationship there, but they needed to understand why they were being assessed, and there needed to be a purpose and not just random assessments to find out what they know. So they were very, very interactive, and a lot of great ideas came out of our session. So it was a very good session today.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think this notion of really being clear and focused on what's the purpose of assessment, what are we trying to accomplish, what are we trying to learn about where our students are in their learning so that it can inform our instruction is really extraordinarily important. And I'm glad that was a real focus of the conversation that you had. I'm going to wrap us up in just a moment here. I would ask that you please do the survey that we put out for this session. I've just put it in the chat box. And so if you could copy that and paste that into a browser and take that survey, it'll take less than a minute, and it will give us some good information and also allow the Tennessee Department of Education to know how to apply your TASL credits either to this year or to next year. So please take a moment and do the survey. It's very helpful to us in getting your feedback and making sure this is a great experience, a great learning experience for all of you. And as we wrap up, I want to thank the Tennessee Department of Education. I want to thank Tennessee SCORE, and I want to thank Instruction Partners and the American Institutes for Research, who were our partners today in this work around assessment. But probably more than anything, I want to make sure that I thank you, our school leaders who are doing this incredibly important work for our students every day. And I admire your leadership. I admire your tenacity and perseverance through these challenging times. And I just appreciate what you do for the school children of Tennessee every day. Thank you for being with us. I hope you'll join us next week for the Principal Professional Learning Series, when we do talk about differentiation, personalization, and intervention. So again, thank you for your engagement. Thank you for all you do for children every day, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care.